What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at J. Warner Wallace's son, Jimmy Wallace. Jimmy has recently produced a video where he argues for the historical Jesus, but he does it from a very ignorant position. He comes from the position that the Gospels are written by the disciples and that the Gospels and Acts are the reason why we know that Jesus existed historically. He makes a lot of claims in this that go against the facts about early Christianity. So, if you want to know how bad Jimmy Wallace fucks up in this video defending the historical Jesus, then please stay tuned. Well, heathens, before we get into today's video, I do want to implore everybody to go and check out my app in your respective app stores. It's called Crestus. It's going to contain all of the information that I am presenting here today. Some of it's not in there yet, but it will appear in there when I get it updated. I am on the precipice of releasing a really massive update to the application, so definitely go and get that right now so you can have the most up-to-date information defending mythicism at your fingertips.
For most of my life, even though I was a Christian at a pretty young age, for most of my life, I never really heard anyone talk about Jesus as though he was anything other than a historical figure.
I have to admit, I'm in the same boat. For most of my life, it was never proposed to me that Jesus could potentially not have even existed in history. But then again, I live in North Alabama, and the very concept of God even not existing was not a thing that was ever discussed or presented to me. So when I finally confronted the possibility that God could not exist, I could not help but go the direction of coming to the conclusion that he probably doesn't. But even then, after I realized that I was not convinced that a God does exist, I still thought of Jesus as a historical person. And just like my investigation of whether or not God exists, once I started looking into the facts surrounding Jesus' existence historically, I finally came to the conclusion that he's most likely a myth, like completely.
Even in school, talking to friends and people who were not Christians, I mean, it seemed like, for the most part, everyone accepted the idea that Jesus was a real guy. Whether you thought he was God or not was a whole separate issue, but the idea that he had existed seemed to be undisputed, at least in my own personal experience. But as I got older and got into my high school age, I started to hear more often this objection that some people believed that Jesus had never lived, that he himself was part of a mythology that Christians had created over time, that there never had been a person named Jesus who was born. He'd never lived, he never died of crucifixion, that all of this was just part of the myth.
Mythicism does have a somewhat long past, but most of that past is filled with claims and just a lot of things that are not evidentially supported. So the only kind of mythicism that I support and I hold to is minimal mythicism that is most plainly laid out by Richard Carrier in his On the Historicity of Jesus.
That Jesus himself was not a real historical person. Well, this is very foundational. The idea that Jesus lived is foundational to Christianity. You know, I want to be a Christian because it's true, but if I'm going to believe that this guy Jesus lived and died for my sins, then it needs to be true that he really lived, that he really existed.
Well, no, it doesn't. Like, Christianity doesn't necessitate that Jesus existed in history. You can definitely accept that Jesus did not walk on this earth but still remain a Christian, because what you're really looking for is the spiritual truth contained in Christianity. Because just some, Jewish fuck in the first century walking around claiming that he's God is not going to accomplish what Christianity wanted to accomplish. What Christianity wanted to accomplish was to absolve the sins of the Jewish people, give them a route to heaven that they can easily attain and retain. That's the point of it. The entire point of Christianity is his death, resurrection, and absolution of sins. Not that he existed. His death, resurrection, and absolution of sins could have totally been done in a celestial realm, much like other dying and rising gods of the time, most namely Osiris. Now, Osiris, he had earthly tales told about him where he was a physical person on this earth. But then in the higher ups of the cult, what you had was this understanding that all of the stories told in the lower parts of the cult that were supposedly taking place on earth were actually taking place in the celestial realm, and that everything that Osiris did was contained in the celestial realm. So with this notion and the fact that cults around this area where Christianity sprung up most likely influenced the originators of Christianity, it's easy to see that you do not need a physical presence on this earth in order for the first Christians, the real first Christians that we don't know a thing about. It's very plausible that they took this Jesus figure to have done all of this in the celestial realm, because this celestial realm was a physical place to them. I mean, this was taking place in the lower parts of the firmament, like right on top of the earth. That's supposedly where Satan is. So these were physical places. They just were not on the face of the earth, but rather on top of the earth. And this is all found in the cults of the time. It's really outrageous to say that Christianity was any different, most namely because in the Jewish scriptures, they explicitly say that the firmament was a physical place, that Satan was contained there, as well as shit happening in the celestial realm.
So it kind of begs the question, I mean, is there good evidence to believe that Jesus himself even existed historically? Even before we get to the question about whether he was God, did Jesus even live? Was he ever born? Did he ever die?
No. Wow, that was a good video. How y'all guys like that?
I did.
Thank you, honey.
You're welcome.
I think there are actually some good reasons to believe that Jesus is a true historical person. One thing that I never see, at least in my personal experience, I've never seen any person argue that the disciples, the followers of Jesus, or the people who said they were followers of Jesus, the earliest Christians, that they did not exist. And I think it's easy to see that they existed because these people not only wrote letters and books, which ended up being in our Bible, they not only had different historical impact, but they had followers that they taught, essentially their own disciples, who then wrote about them.
All of this is horse shit. For one thing, the minimal mythicist position, the only empirically supported position, definitely states that the disciples most likely didn't exist. Because if Jesus didn't exist, then his disciples definitely didn't exist. He alludes here to the disciples writing letters and books that eventually came to be in the New Testament. But what he's assuming here are that the named authors on the Gospels are the ones that wrote those books. They aren't. The idea that the named authors are the ones that wrote the books didn't come into being until like the middle to late 2nd century. For all that we can tell, the disciples were invented with the Gospels. These Gospels were initially untitled. They were just known as the Gospel of Jesus at the time. And then several different sects had different ideas about what Jesus supposedly did while he was on this earth. So they copied and redacted other gospels that had appeared so that they could push their own narratives. Paul was the first one to write about a supposed Jesus Christ. He never mentions anybody as a disciple. He only mentions people as apostles of Jesus. Now, apostles are not people that walked with Jesus. Those would be disciples. Apostles were those that had received a revelation from Jesus and had studied the scriptures while smoking some pot. Those were the apostles, which Paul considered himself an apostle. So if the disciples didn't exist, then the disciples definitely didn't have any disciples of their own. Any claims of anybody being a disciple of, let's say, the Apostle John, only come from later claims of that person, not the person themselves claiming to be the disciple of the Apostle John, but just other people looking to source their information directly to a disciple and making shit up.
And what they had done and what they'd passed on, what teachings they had. And so it's clear that the disciples, the people who said that they knew Jesus and walked with him and said that they were passing along Jesus' teaching, that they really lived, that they are all historic people, that they really existed. And the question more comes down to is the guy they're talking about, Jesus. They keep all these real historical people keep talking about this guy Jesus who lived and died and rose from the dead. Were they telling the truth, or are they essentially creating a mythology about Jesus?
Well, the mythology surrounding Jesus was already developed by Paul's time. This is plainly seen in Paul's writings. So it wasn't so much that they were just making some shit up. They were using the scriptures as well as what was already known about Jesus in order to concoct stories so that they could teach things to the Christians. Teach the core tenets of Christianity to them through this supposed Jesus Christ. The main problem that I see right here with what Jimmy is saying is that he assumes the people that wrote the Gospels are the named authors and that these were historical people that were in fact disciples of Jesus. When in fact, we don't know if there were any disciples whatsoever, but they most likely didn't exist considering that Paul never mentions anybody as a disciple. And there are people that Paul mentions who eventually end up becoming disciples of Jesus in the Gospels. So no, it's not that they were lying or making something up out of whole cloth or something like that. They were just using what they already knew about Judaism and Jesus to concoct these stories.
Well, we know that these followers of Jesus were writing books pretty early. Jesus, supposedly died in the mid-30s AD. Well, the first part of the New Testament that was written is written about the mid-50s. So about 20 years or so after Jesus supposedly died. The New Testament, we often think about the Bible as being like one book, but the Bible is made of many books and letters, and the New Testament itself is a collection of books which tell the story of Jesus and letters which were written by people in the church to other Christians talking about their faith and religion. And the earliest thing that was written in the New Testament is the book of 1 Corinthians. It's a book written to the city of Corinth by a guy named Paul, who says he's an early follower of Jesus. In fact, Paul claims to have had an encounter with Jesus.
Well, we need to be very specific here. I do agree that Paul was writing in the 50s and that Jesus supposedly died in the 30s, although one caveat, early 30s, not mid 30s. But also we have to clarify what Paul means by an experience with Jesus or an encounter with Jesus. We're not talking about like a physical encounter with Jesus like here on earth before he died and all this other shit, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Paul having a hallucination of Jesus, in which Jesus appeared to be somewhat physical to him. Paul even claims in his letters that Jesus took on a physical form, it even had blood and all this other stuff, but this is all perfectly understood if you understand what the Jewish scriptures say about this Messiah figure. But regardless of all that, the encounter that Paul had was not a physical one that historically happened here on earth. This was a hallucination or a celestial experience that Paul had.
Now, regardless of whether you believe his claims that Jesus is God, it's hard to dispute the fact that Paul is writing very early after the time that Jesus supposedly lived. And as he's writing to the city of Corinth, he's mentioning Jesus, and it's clear that there's already a robust religion that has formed around the idea that Jesus is God. He is in a separate part of the world writing to the city of Corinth, discussing religious issues that they all share in common, religious beliefs that they all believe together. So very quickly after this supposed life of Jesus, Christians are already in existence. They're already writing about a pretty well-developed religion, and they're already making the claim that Jesus, not only that Jesus is God, but more foundationally that Jesus lived, that there was a guy named Jesus.
Technically here, everything that he just said could be believed without needing a physical Jesus. Just the mere belief that Jesus represented those things, like being the Son of God and that he died and resurrected and all that, just the mere belief is all that was required for the later Christians to adopt it. You see, he talks about how this whole religion just sort of came up somewhat out of nowhere, but he fails to indicate that the earliest Christians were actually Jewish Christians. There's an intermediate group between Jews and Christians. Those would be the Jewish Christians. These would be the actual first Christians that were in existence. They held to both Jewish laws as well as this new Christian understanding. So while, yes, there was a shift to Christianity in some of the Jewish sects that were around in the first century, but considering how the Jewish lore is set up, which we'll probably get into here in a little bit, it was a very slight shift from Jew to Jewish Christian.
Now, this is so early in history that many of the people who would have been around Jerusalem when Jesus is supposedly doing all these public work would know whether or not the stories about Jesus are true or not. Because remember, Jesus didn't die that long ago. And if now there's people writing letters and forming religions over the idea that this guy lived just 20 years ago, well, it's going to be hard to argue that this person was made up whole cloth. In fact, it would be really easy if you wanted to destroy the new religion of Christianity in its early days, that all you would need to do is prove that, well, that guy that Paul and all these other apostles, that Peter and Mark and Matthew and everybody's talking about, that guy never even lived.
So you seriously think that they should have to prove a negative? That's essentially what you're asking here, is that if Christianity was quote unquote made up out of whole cloth, that it would have been easy to disprove by just showing that Jesus never existed in the first place. How exactly were they supposed to do this in the first century? Like, this comes up later with the whole 500 witnesses or whatever. Like, how are you supposed to find those 500 witnesses that supposedly saw Jesus in his resurrected form when no real information is given about these 500 people? Just like with Jesus, why are they supposed to prove a negative in this instance? But also, what he's mentioning here is quite contrary to the Jewish beliefs of the first century, because Christianity was not made up out of whole cloth. There were definitely sects of Jews in the first century that were reading the Jewish scriptures to be prophecies about this Messiah figure, most namely Daniel 9, Isaiah 52 to 53, as well as the Wisdom of Solomon. We see evidence of this in Philo of Alexandria. And then much later on in the timeline, the Talmud also admits that the Jews were interpreting these supposed prophecies to be about this Messiah figure. Now, the reason why I mentioned the Talmud here is that even though it's a pretty late document, stemming from about the 4th or 5th century, it still represents a very old understanding of the Jewish scriptures. The 3rd or 4th century Jews are not going to invent understandings of the old Jewish scriptures that would in turn validate Christianity. That just wouldn't happen. But also we have evidence in Tacitus, Josephus, and even Suetonius. They mention how the Jews were using a interpretation of a prophecy in their scriptures in order to expect some kind of coming triumph within the Jewish community, a triumph that was supposed to set up a worldwide empire and shit. So it's painfully obvious, just looking at the bare facts of history, that the Jews were definitely expecting a suffering, disgraced, and dying Messiah that would resurrect from the dead to absolve sins. This is painfully obvious when you read the Jewish scriptures. And this is exactly what Paul means in Galatians when he talks about how he only gets his information from the scriptures and from visions of Jesus, that he does not get his information from any person on earth. So no, Christianity wasn't made up whole cloth. It was actually stitched together through different understandings of Jewish prophecies about the Messiah figure. This was an expected outcome for the Jews. There's this timeline laid out in Daniel that actually culminates in the 30s AD. So these Jews were definitely expecting some kind of Messiah figure to absolve them from their sins.
But we don't actually see that in history. We don't ever see any record that Jesus does not exist. The early Jewish people in Israel would have wanted to remove any type of momentum that the early Christians would have, because now Christianity is springing up and it is a competitor religion to Judaism, which is the common religion in Israel. So those religious Jewish leaders might want to have just mentioned, hey, all you Christians, that guy Jesus never even existed. I mean, that would be pretty easy to take all the wind out of the sails of the early Christians, but you don't see that.
I don't think that you need to see that, because what evidence could you provide in the first century to prove to very delusional and indoctrinated people that their savior didn't even exist? What could you do in the first century to prove a negative like that? Me, with this video, in my own position of minimal mythicism, I'm not looking to prove that Jesus didn't exist. I'm saying that he most likely didn't exist. But there's no evidence that anybody can present to prove that he definitely didn't exist. What is incumbent upon you, as well as the first century Christians who were saying that Jesus existed or that Jesus walked the earth. They need to prove that he did. But if you're looking for evidence within the New Testament itself that there were a sect of Jews in the first century that were claiming that Jesus was some kind of mythical figure, or rather a celestial figure, a purely celestial figure, then all you need to do is turn to 2 Peter 1:16. In that section it says, "For we didn't follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." There would be no reason to make up a eyewitness to Jesus, being that 2 Peter is a forged document that is in the New Testament. There would be no reason to make up this new eyewitness to Jesus if Jesus had not been a purely celestial figure, at least to some Jews in the first century. I just really feel like you've got a bass-backward sense of logic here.
Instead, you see Christians early on writing about this guy, Jesus. And much of the New Testament is written fairly shortly thereafter. And then you see that even historical people who are the disciples of the disciples, they're talking about Jesus as though he lived. And these are guys who are living essentially one generation after the disciples of Jesus.
Well, no, really, the ones that were living about a generation after Jesus supposedly died were the people that wrote the Gospels, these anonymous authors, because the Gospels were being written at a time when any of the disciples, if they even existed, would have been dying off. So there was no way for these people to be disproven at that time. There were no eyewitnesses around. There was nobody to stand up and be like, hey, that's bullshit. I was there that day. Nothing the fuck happened. There was nobody around to say that. So they just made it up using the Jewish scriptures and what they already knew about Jesus. In a sense, you could say that Christianity is just Jewish fan fiction.
So pretty early in history, there's lots of discussion amongst Christians about this guy, Jesus. Now, there is some discussion outside of Christianity, but typically it's people talking about the Christians themselves. Jewish people, Greek people, Romans, who are saying, hey, historians who are saying, hey, there's these Christian people, and they all say that there's this guy, Jesus, that they follow.
Well, I contest this a little bit because they don't say, oh, there's these Christians and they follow this guy Jesus. They don't really say that. I mean, in Tacitus, there is the one line where it kind of talks about it, but that's most likely an interpolation. You can bring up Josephus and all this other stuff, but those are also either wholly inserted or interpolation. Most, if not all, of the extra biblical sources for this Jesus figure are actually talking about Christians themselves and what they believe, not about Jesus as a historical figure or that Jesus actually walked the earth, so therefore that's why these people believed. It was just basically the Christian tenets, like what do Christians believe? That's all that they were talking about. This is far removed from establishing Jesus as a historical figure.
So we know that Christianity starts really early. We can see it from not just the Christian writings that are religious writings, but also these secular or non-Christian sources that are at least mentioning that Christianity existed. Okay, now they're not saying that Jesus is God, but we can see that pretty quickly after the time that Jesus supposedly lived, there's all of a sudden a bunch of literature about him. There's other people talking about, yeah, there's a bunch of followers of Jesus. So there's certainly some type of impact. And so in some ways we can see the impact that Jesus has on the world around him suggests that there is a Jesus itself.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Well, yes, but also just the mere belief about Jesus as this Messiah figure who is the Son of God that absolves the sins of all mankind. Just the mere belief in that could also explain the rise of Christianity. Everything that we know about Jesus is contained in the Jewish scriptures. So I don't see this as a very compelling piece of evidence to suggest that Jesus really did exist. If you have just mere belief that can also explain everything that you're saying, then you really don't have evidence for historicity.
I think we can also look at the lives of the apostles and the disciples, the people that would have known whether this is a true story or not. There was a pretty tremendous religious persecution amongst the early Christians. And some of the disciples, the early followers of Jesus, end up being persecuted to the point where you got people getting exiled to out of the country to islands. You got people who are getting killed for their beliefs. Now, not every disciple of Jesus may or may not have actually been martyred, but we know that some were, and some, like John, end up getting exiled.
Again, all of this is horseshit. Most of this stems from Acts, which is most plausibly historical fiction. So we don't have any kind of historical records that suggest that the disciples or the earliest Christians were ever martyred for what they believed in. Were later Christians eventually martyred for what they believed in? Sure. But at that point, they were so removed from the original Christian sects that they just wholly believed in the faith without any evidence. Even of the apostles that we know about that died were not exactly martyred. I mean, they were killed, but I really don't think that you can make a solid case that they were killed just because they were Christians, which is the implication of martyrdom here. You can't even solidly place when Paul was executed. All of this is leading to the conclusion that, all of these people, they put themselves in danger. They sacrificed their lives. Would they have done that for a lie? Well, for one, yes, you can die for a lie. That's ridiculous to suggest that people don't die for lies. They die for lies all the time. Two, these people didn't think that they believed in a lie. They were not the originators of the Jewish Christian sect that started Christianity. So you're just completely wrong in this particular thought process there, Jimmy.
Over time, the disciples, as they're going around telling the story of Jesus, they end up traveling really far from each other. Some go to Africa, some go to Rome, some stay in Israel, some go towards India, and they're trying to get as far as they can to spread the gospel far and wide. They're all separated and this is 2,000 years ago. There's even sending a letter is going to be very difficult and take a long time. There's very little way for them to communicate. So the fact that they can, under persecution, sometimes even persecution to death, under this tremendous amount of pressure, you still have people who are saying, no, I'm telling the truth. I'm willing to die because I know I'm telling the truth that Jesus was a real guy who lived. They're making more claims than just that he lived. They're making claims that he's God, that he raised from the dead. But the basic idea that Jesus lived, there's a bunch of people who are getting persecuted and are suffering for the idea that they just won't recant this statement that Jesus really lived. They're dying for that statement.
No, that is not the statement that they're dying for. And it's quite dubious of you to frame it as though they were dying for that statement. The Christians that were eventually martyred for their beliefs were dying for the belief that Jesus was God and has absolved their sins. That's what it means to be a Christian. Just because you acknowledge that Jesus existed in history or lived at one time does not mean that you're a Christian. So to say that they were dying because they admitted that this guy existed is just misrepresenting what the eventual Christian martyrs were actually dying for. And of course, he comes to his conclusion of, would they die for a lie? Yeah, they would. But it still doesn't matter because they didn't believe that they were lies. Even the apostles that were eventually killed in one way or another, they wouldn't have been dying for a lie even if they were being killed for being a Christian. Because they wholly believed in the faith. Just the mere belief that Jesus resurrected and absolved their sins.
So I think it's a little hard to understand why, if this was a made-up story that Jesus never lived, that all these people who said they knew him personally would allow themselves to be persecuted. You'd think at least one of those people who knew better, who knew that they were lying, would be like, we made it up. Don't banish me, or banish me but don't kill me, or whatever. I've had enough of this. I'll come clean. But
no, again, nobody said that they personally knew Jesus. That was never something that was ever substantiated with evidence. And the earliest Christians, even they wholly believed in Jesus, being that he died for their sins and that he resurrected on the third day and, he is the way, the truth, and the life. They wholly believed in this. Even as Jewish Christians who originated the sect, they wholly believed that this happened.
There's no historical record of any of those early followers ever recanting their statements. In fact, every historical record we have says that they went through their entire lives devoted to the idea that Jesus really lived.
Well, no, not that he really lived, but that he died, resurrected, and absolved them of their sins. That's what they believed. They did not go around proclaiming that he, walked the earth. That's not something that they did. You keep rephrasing the earliest Christian beliefs as just being about whether or not he existed on this earth. You're totally disregarding the fact that these Christians did not need him to exist on earth, and that Jesus did not need to exist on earth to accomplish the things that he is said to have accomplished in the Gospels. These are all things that could definitely be accomplished in the lower heavens, in this celestial realm, which is exactly where Paul, the earliest writing that we have about Jesus, says that he got this information from a celestial figure of Jesus. Not from any historical source whatsoever, but from the celestial version of Jesus after he had already died and resurrected. And we have no documentation whatsoever anywhere that suggests that Jesus needed to be on earth for any of this to happen. So for you to rephrase these early Jewish Christian beliefs as being about him walking the earth is just completely disingenuous.
I think there's great reason to believe that Jesus is a real historical person. You see the impact he had on the lives of those around him. And you do see early Christians writing about Jesus. Some of the Gospels are written by people who say, I knew Jesus personally. I was there when he made these statements, when he gave these speeches, and I'm going to document them myself before I die so other people can see it.
No, they didn't claim that. You cannot quote me a verse in the Gospels that says, I walked with Jesus and I am writing this. My name is John Mark, or my name is Matthew, or my name is Luke, or my name is the Apostle John. You cannot cite me a verse in the Gospels where it says that. None of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. They were written anonymously 40 years after Jesus supposedly died. And even then, you've only got really one Gospel, and that's Mark. And Mark doesn't give two shits about where Jesus came from, his birth story, like what he did when he was 15 years old. That doesn't really matter to Mark, because in Mark, you have the Messiah figure that is prominent in Jewish lore descend upon this human figure of Jesus and inhabit his body, wear it around like a skinwalker, and then once he's dead on the cross, he goes back up into heaven. Well, he first goes, nosedives into hell, and then he goes back up into heaven. You have to understand that the only gospel that we really have that attests to some kind of historical figure of Jesus just very prominently has it as a Messiah spirit that inhabits the body. And everything in that gospel is sourced to Jewish scripture. Absolutely everything. So no, everything that he just said is complete and utter trash.
But most people would not consider, most secular people would not consider that to be historical. They would say, hey, when Matthew writes his gospel, you can't trust Matthew as a historian. He's writing about miracles Jesus happened or, performed, and that Jesus came back from the dead. He's writing crazy stuff. You can't trust him. He's biased. He's a Christian.
Well, no, that's not why we would disregard Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. We would disregard them on the fact that they don't list any historical sources for their information. They don't list who their authors are. They don't list anybody as a historical source whatsoever. You know what they do list as their source, though? The Jewish scripture. The Gospel of Mark, its author, was also informed by Paul's theology. So really, everything in Christianity dates back to Paul.
So even though Matthew lived at the right time and says he knew Jesus, they would argue that, hey, some people would argue that he doesn't count as a witness or he doesn't count as a true historian. But I would just ask you this. If we're looking for a historian in history who wrote about Jesus' life, a historian who said Jesus lived and throughout his life performed miracles and claimed he was God, and then he got crucified for his beliefs, and then 3 days later he rose from the dead and he appeared to all these people. If you're looking for a historian who would document those things but not be a Christian, what kind of person are you really looking for? I mean, who would you really be describing? Who would really believe all those things about Jesus but not be a Christian?
Well, I don't think that you necessarily have to believe all of those things in order to report that that's what Christians believe, which is exactly what we find in later historians talking about what Christians believe. These non-Christian sources that are so regularly touted by historicists, they didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God and he resurrected and all that, but they did report what the Christians believe. A good example of this would be Pliny the Younger. He reported what the Christians believe, more specifically when they practiced their holy ceremonies and shit. We also don't need the author of this historical reference that we're postulating here to be a non-Christian. They could totally be a Christian. Just like with Paul, we get a lot of good historical information from Paul, but it's just not historical information that leans in your favor of historicity. All of the information in Paul actually leans away from historicity or is neutral on the historical claim. So the fact that we regularly use Paul in order to establish certain facts about Christianity and what Christians believe in the first century seems to indicate that we don't need specifically non-Christians to reference Jesus. But also, in order to establish that Jesus existed, all you need is just a mere reference to Jesus actually existing. That doesn't entail stating that this Jesus actually died, resurrected, and absolved sins and all this other stuff. They don't need to say all of that extra shit, just that there was this fucker named Jesus, he did some magical tricks and convinced a bunch of people, and then he got fucked over by the Romans. Like, that's what we would need, but every single reference that even comes close to that is an interpolation that was put in these historical works by later Christians.
In fact, many of the people who end up becoming Christians in the early Christian church are people who were skeptical at first, but because of the things they saw in Jesus' life, became Christians. And then after they're Christians, start producing Christian literature, writing the teachings of Jesus, the story of Jesus, different religious principles that Jesus would have wanted people to follow. That's how they become the Christian. And so I don't know if we're looking for, we can't believe Jesus is a historical person unless a Roman guy says that Jesus lived and performed miracles and died and rose from the dead. I mean, I'm just not. Yeah, we're probably asking for too much from the historical record.
Well, no, because that's not what mythicists want out of the historical record. You're totally misrepresenting what would clearly be needed to establish that Jesus was historical. Because we don't need all of that extra shit. Everything after Jesus walked the earth or Jesus existed in history, we just simply don't need. All we need is a reference to some Jewish fuck named Jesus that gathered a following prior to the 30s AD. Like, that's what we would need, but yet we don't find that, not even in Paul.
I don't think it's reasonable to think that nobody existed, that Jesus didn't exist, and all of Christianity sprung up from nothing. I think that goes beyond a reasonable explanation. I think truly when we look at what happened in history, that all of a sudden there's this religion that springs up, and that all the followers, those early followers, are saying that they knew this guy personally, and they're willing to even die for their belief that this guy really lived and that they really knew him. I think the most reasonable thing to believe is, yeah, Jesus was a real person. He must have lived because you can see the tremendous impact he had on the lives of the people who were in his life.
Well, no, none of that is actually true. Plus, mythicists do not say that he was completely made up out of thin air. He was established using an understanding of the Jewish lore that it already existed. This Messiah figure that was coming to absolve the Jewish people through a shameful death and resurrection was already expected by the Jews. So it's only a slight shift from expecting it to, oh shit, it happened, in order for Christianity to come about. The early Jewish Christians that existed, they didn't just pop out of thin air, out of whole cloth, like you seem to think that they do, because your hypothesis entails that this Jesus figure existed and that there was no understanding prior to this point that this Jesus figure was supposed to come, and then all of a sudden he appears and Christians are created. Whereas my hypothesis, the minimal mythicist hypothesis, is much more parsimonious. That the idea of this suffering and dying Messiah who was to be put to a shameful death that would eventually absolve our sins was to come around the 30s AD. And when the 30s AD got there, they assumed that he came, that it all happened in the celestial realm, just like in other cults at the time. Considering the fact that in Jewish lore, the firmament, the lower heavens, was a physical place where physical things existed, it's very easy to see how it eventually transformed from this celestial plane, which was physical, to the more earthly plane down here over the course of about 40 years. We see this in other modern cults that we can actually look at for case studies, like the Luddites, like the cargo cults, and like the Roswell incident, provoking a number of UFO experiences and a whole subculture of UFO enthusiasts. All of these things developed in a matter of decades, just like what happened with Christianity. Well, heathens, I have to say I'm not very impressed by Jimmy Wallace's defense of historicity here. For one thing, he assumes that the Gospels are written by disciples. He assumes that the disciples existed, even though there's no evidence of them existing prior to the Gospels. And he thinks that the Gospels were written a lot earlier than they actually were. He claims that it would have been easy to refute Christianity just by pointing out how this Jesus person didn't exist. But he fails to incorporate the Jewish understanding of what the celestial plane was and how things could still happen in the celestial plane that affected us here on earth. He totally ignores a lot of Christian theology when concerning how these first Jewish Christians would have actually believed in the faith. Everything that he mentioned in this video would have come about just by the mere belief that it happened, and not that it actually happened. What historicists are tasked with is giving us some kind of evidence that suggests that Jesus had to exist in order for Christianity to come into being. My guess is that you will never find that piece of evidence because I don't think it exists. The mere belief that Jesus existed either in a celestial realm or even on earth, and then died and resurrected for sins, just the mere belief that all that happened is all that was needed for Christianity to come about. Thank you, heathens, for watching today. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you think about Jimmy Wallace's video. Do you think that he had some solid points here? Do you think that I failed in refuting his points? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens!